In the world of business, every great company strives to maximize profits, grow the business, and attract top talent. But one of the most important and key aspects that can never be understated is protecting your assets. Whether that be the vital people within the company, property, or really anything important of value. That's why every reputable company has insurance just in case a threat arises or an accident would occur. Believe it or not, this principle or idea of using an asset protection service or tool actually applies to the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game as well. From a historical standpoint, they've most notably come in the form of powerful and popular battle trap cards like Mirror Force, Sakuretsu Armor, and Dimensional Prison. But what if I told you there was another class of strong and epic trap cards that, while not explicitly battle traps, could be just as potent and impactful if used correctly? And what if I told you that one of these cards showed up and shined across numerous Yu-Gi-Oh! Eras, popping up in meta decks again and again, and that it allowed even odd decks to capitalize on niche interactions to truly max out on their potential? Well, at that point, I'd hope that I had piqued your interest enough to listen to one of the game's oldest and most niche trap cards that rose to being a mainstay in the meta elite. It's time to break out your old Yu-Gi-Oh! Shoebox full of commons, because this video is all about how Wabaku infiltrated the Yu-Gi-Oh! Metagame again and again. If you've ever watched the Duelist Kingdom season of the Yu-Gi-Oh! DM anime, or you're just a super boomer like myself and maybe you played during this era, you'll probably remember seeing the card. Wabaku was first released in the TCG and the iconic starter deck Yugi circa March 29th, 2002. It was a lowly common, but in being released in one of the two of the TCG's first starter decks, it basically meant everyone had access to the card. Even in the fairly frequent event that the starter deck Yugi was sold out at your local retailer, you could just go to locals and there'd probably be about a half a dozen players willing to throw a copy or two in the trades. Wabaku was an early powerhouse and came with a unique effect unlike anything else in the game. By the way, I know you're probably thinking of another roaring card with a similar use, but that card wouldn't be released for another 3 years, so we'll put that on the back burner. Wabaku was kind of in a class of its own, with its very original effect that said make all battle damage inflicted by monsters on your opponent's side of the field 0 during this turn. If it sounds worded poorly and a tiny bit confusing, that's because it is, and well, it is. That's the original non-PSCT text that basically stated you took no battle damage from your opponent's monsters in a turn that Wabaku resolved. Also, while it wasn't super clear to the 15-year-old version of me, it meant that your opponent's monsters couldn't destroy yours in battle as well. Remember that for later. Wabaku did see play after its release, but full disclosure, it's kinda hard to gauge how successful it actually was, for the TCG anyways. That's because prior to 2005, competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! In the TCG was basically just locals. I'll use my own teenage years starting out in the game as a reference point. At my locals in Baltimore, much like Trap Hole, Wabaku was a solid trap that we threw in basically everything. Sure, it didn't remove any of your opponent's monsters off the field, but it was great for protecting your monsters in battle, and more notably, your life points if you were ever hit with a Dark Hole or Regeki. It also didn't have the insanely high price tag like Mirror Force, which, believe it or not, many duelists starting out couldn't initially get their hands on. As more core sets were released, however, Wabaku would find stiff competition from other blockbuster trap cards like Ring of Destruction and Torrential Tribute. The continual release of powerful utility effects evolved the DM era into one where it was fairly hard to simplify game states quickly, and card advantage started to become king. This was the undoubted downfall of Wabaku, at least for the main deck. Its blanket protection effect was still unmatched, but it came at the cost of taking a hefty -1. Compared to cards like Ring and Mirror Force that offered defense and the potential to wipe monsters off your opponent's boards, they generally were seen as cards with higher upside. This led to Wabaku taking a back seat, but still finding its way into the side deck of many high-end competitive deck lists. Throughout 2005 and 2006, Wabaku was a sideboard mainstay. While again, not the greatest use of card advantage, Wabaku was fantastic to chain to cards like Mystical Space Typhoon and Heavy Storm, which was a good way to offset the minus in card advantage. Where Wabaku first truly broke through and started to see main deck play in viable competitive decks was at the very end of 2006, leading into 07. The first stop was Chainburn, a deck that didn't have much interest in interacting all that much with the opponent or playing Yu-Gi-Oh! In the standard or traditional way. A pair of deviant duelists like my old pal Thomas Majuris both use multiple Wabaku in their Chainburn builds en route to finishing in the quarterfinals of the last Shonen Jump Championship of the year held in San Jose, California. In Chainburn, it wasn't optimal to run a bunch of monsters in attempting to stop your opponent's offense. Those monsters could easily lose out to common removal cards like Zaborg the Thunder Monarch or Soul Exchange, so instead it was much more effective to use a card like Wabaku that canceled all possible battle damage you take in any turn. Wabaku was also favorable in Chainburn because the activation helped build chain links necessary for massive burn damage with Chain Strike and extra draw power thanks to accumulated fortune. All things considered, Wabaku just made a ton of sense here. Shortly after in 2007, we'd see two offensive powerhouses lean on Wabaku heavily. Although once again, in the side, the decks were the Chimera Tech Overdragon OTK and Diamond Dew Turbo, both of which won Shonen Jumps during this year. The decks were pretty similar in the sense that they could explode at any moment for swift and devastating OTKs. The only thing they really needed was time. In games 2 and 3, it was common to see opposing players play very aggressively because the decks were known for playing little to no defensive cards that would punish overextension. The DDT and Chimera players knew they'd have a shorter leash in those games, and a card like Wabaku could easily buy them an extra turn or maybe turns in a perfect scenario. With these explosive decks, a single turn could easily be the difference between victory and defeat, so once again, it just made sense. Wabaku continued to be a heavily side deck card, especially against the high-octane OTK style decks, but in 2008, it saw its first success story within an archetype, and that was with Gladiator Beast. As you all know, the Gladiator archetype was first and foremost battle focused, but Glad monsters themselves didn't actually have the highest attack values. Heck, only one of them could be freely summoned with no tributes or contact fusions to match a simple Stratos at the time. Insert Wabaku, the card that solved that problem completely. Wabaku is not only a chainable defense card that would protect all your Glads from dying in battle and would allow them to tag out, but unlike Threatening Roar, could be used during your turn. This meant that you could just flip it over, ram your Glad headfirst into something like a Dark Armed Dragon for instance, then tag that same Glad out and go for a massive Gyzaris play. Initially, Team Overdose sided the card, but post Light of Destruction, when Glads completely took over the metagame, it was common to see it in main decks pretty much everywhere. Even after the Glad format moving into the 5Ds era, Wabaku was still incredibly popular within the deck because the synergy it had with Glads tagging out. Just like in Chainburn, Gladiator Beasts were able to effectively move Wabaku into the main deck and mitigate the negative card economy by potentially making the advantage up on the back end. Tagging out could easily lead to an MST, Monster Reborn, Gyzaris, or a Smashing Ground. Heck, Glads had so many powerful utility effects that you were usually left in a good position, regardless of the neg one that you took. Wabaku would continue to see play in loads of decks throughout 5Ds and in the Zexal. During Zexal specifically, it really shined in Prophecy. There wasn't the unique synergy as there was with Glads, but in spellbooks, it was basically used for the exact opposite reason as the high-powered GX decks. Prophecy was one of Zexal's most consistent control decks, and with the Spellbook Tower's recycling ability, the deck had a phenomenal grind game. It could easily lock out special summoning via Jogan the Spiritualist and force the opponent into a one summon per turn game state, which was almost always answered with Spellbook of Fate's banishing effect. When the Prophecy player needed a little more extra protection for Jogan and didn't have access to Fate, Wabaku served as the perfect insurance policy or backup plan. This of course was used to protect Jogan from any attack and perfectly complemented the Prophecy deck's Protect the Castle theme. If you've ever played against Floowandereeze when they had access to Barrier Statue of the Stormwinds, this was essentially like an earlier version of that. But to be fair, Wabaku was honestly just a very strong card in the Dragon Ruler spellbook format in general, and that's because it was a terrific counter to the horrifying Return from the Different Dimension trap card that was not only legal during this format, but was also the epitome of game stealing. Lastly, in 2016 to 2017, there was the run during Arc V, which saw Wabaku's popularity absolutely skyrocket. It should be obvious why, but this was due to the Paleozoic archetype. Paleozoic was like a trap player's dream, an entire archetype of trap cards with various utility effects that could also be summoned as monsters to later make either the theme's Xyz or one of the most powerful Xyz monsters of all time and totally awesome. The catch with the Paleozoic cards was a trap had to first be activated on the field for one of them to activate their effect in the graveyard that would freely summon them onto the field as a monster. They were completely unaffected by monster effects at that time and no longer counted as trap cards, making them not the easiest or the hardest things to take down. Usually Battle was their Achilles heel due to their low 1200 attack and abysmal 0 defense. As a common theme throughout this video, just like with Gladiator Beast, Wabaku seemed tailor-made to solve this issue. Wabaku was not only a chainable trap activation that protected all of your monsters on the field, but it was also a 1-for-1 if a Paleo summoned itself as a trap. And just like with Gladiator Beast, Wabaku had to be specifically used in this deck because it could be used during either player's turn, unlike Threatening Roar. This meant that you could summon Paleos during your turn and even in the battle phase. Post the fall of Paleo, Wabaku's play has all but died, mainly due to Yu-Gi-Oh! Being a much more combo-oriented game, and players generally wanting powerful trap cards that can be used effectively going first or second, like Infinite and Permanence. Wabaku really hasn't done much in recent years, but in my opinion, I feel like it's only a matter of time before another meta contender randomly has synergy with it again. Even 20 years later, its effect is only rivaled by a handful of cards in the game, and most of those can only be used during the opponent's turn. I personally find it fascinating that Wabaku initially saw play because there weren't many good trap options, then settled in as a solid side card, but soon, due to themes like Chain Burn and Gladiator Beast, it kind of rose to being good enough to see main deck play and decks that could top 8s or even win major tournaments. It continued to be a niche side deck option, but always had latent potential because of its uniqueness, and that potential was tapped into time and time again, throughout completely different Yu-Gi-Oh! Eras and completely different Yu-Gi-Oh! Archetypes, and for completely different reasons. A testament to how a simple card that grants you unrivaled security and protection for your assets can be used in so many different ways. And with that, we're at the conclusion to this Yu-Gi-Oh! Story. If you enjoyed the video, or more importantly, you learned something, give the video a big thumbs up and let me know what your thoughts were in the comment section below. Thank you for watching, as always.